Hello, everybody. Welcome. Excited to have you joining us today for our PanelCast discussion on migrating to hyperconverged infrastructure. We are going to have some lively discussion here today. Really excited about it, and we're going to be taking a lot of your questions live to the panel. So it's going to be a lot of fun. A couple things here before we get started. I want to make sure that you're aware in your GoToWebinar control panel, there's a questions box. That's where you can type in your question and send it to us, the panel. I'll be keeping an eye on that. And as I'm moderating the discussion here, I'll pull out of the questions that you're asking and distribute those across the panel. So make sure you send those in. You can do that throughout the entirety of the event, and I'll be pulling good questions out of there. Also, as I'm sure some of you are aware, at various times throughout the PanelCast here, we're going to be giving away some $100 Amazon.com gift cards. So make sure and pay attention for the drawings. Also, if you want to take a peek at the prize terms and conditions, if you go over to events.actualtechmedia.com, scroll to the bottom and look in the footer, there's a link there to that if that's something you want to take a peek at. Without taking up any more time, I want to introduce you to the panel and then start taking some questions. So that we have some stuff to talk about, start asking some questions. But while you do that, we're just going to go on down the line here and have everybody introduce themselves. So we'll start with George. George, could you introduce yourself to the audience, please?
Yeah, you bet. So my name is George Wagner, Senior Product Marketing Manager here with Pivot3. I handle basically the product side, messaging, positioning, occasional SE in the field. Prior to this, I was with some other startups, and prior to that, I was an IT manager for quite a while. So managing not only administration, but also managing systems as well.
Cool. We're excited to have you on today. Alan.
Hi, everybody. Name's Alan Conboy. I'm actually off as the CTO here with Scale Computing. Been in the industry longer than I care to admit to, pushing 30 plus years. From a scale perspective, I handle everything from new product development and looking at relationships, biz dev, alliances, technical integrations, and future guidance on how the platform should work.
Very good. Max.
Hey everyone, I'm Max Motilaro. I'm an analyst at Tech Unplugged. I'm based in Europe, got a bit of experience with HCI. I come through the trenches, got from sysadmin all the way to doing analysts and so on. So looking forward to the discussion.
And lastly, Ron.
Hi, I'm Ron Scott Adams. I'm a Senior Product Marketing Manager for VMware with our HCI business unit. So I work with customers and our VMware field and understanding and developing VMware stack story. Prior to my time at VMware, I've ranged everything from systems architecture for Fortune 500 firm to several different partners and integrating a lot of different products. So I like to think I've stood in a lot of shoes on the HCI story and can share some perspective there. And I'm excited for the conversation.
And we're excited to hear it. All right, well, when you all registered for this event, we asked you if you had any questions burning in your mind then, and we collected a few of those. So while you get some more questions popped into the questions panel here, we're going to take some of the ones that you asked when you registered. The first question I want to pose to you guys, the panel, is what does migrating HCI look like? So what is, if I'm in a more traditional architecture and I decide to adopt HCI, what's that process look like? Let's start with you, Ron.
Sure. I think this is something that George and Alan and Max and I, we're all going to have some different perspectives on this based on our experience and, of course, the way our respective solutions work. But I think one overarching story is that this should be a fairly easy, straightforward path in terms of what you can accomplish. And it should be a pretty well-forged one because HCI was really born out of the migration story. In other words, what I mean is it was an evolution of solving shared storage confusion and some of the problems of scale and management that came along. So in terms of practicality, what it looks like, I think one big thing to get right off the bat is this is not the former approach you saw of here's the shiny new box to solve all problems, throw away all the other boxes, and just totally change everything all at once. I think what we're seeing with HCI is really use case addressing. And I think so part of that migration story has been you can develop organically, you can integrate to some extent with existing solutions sometimes, and also you have the story where, yes, you can scale out completely and just say, hey, HCI is taken over my data center. That's what happened for me as an HCI customer. We kind of converted completely to HCI because of the success. But we didn't start that way. We didn't throw away all of our other storage, all of our other solutions, say, well, we're going to do everything this way now and just change it all. We said, here's our problem. Let's solve this problem. And oh, look, here's a way that we can actually have storage and compute that scales well enough and specifically enough to solve this problem and then start solving others.
Max, you've actually done some of this. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, coming from the old world of traditional infrastructures, it goes back to what Ron was saying. You're really getting into a new model of working with your infrastructure, a new way of expanding the infrastructure. You're no longer tied to, okay, I'm done here consuming the storage on my box. I need to bring in a new box and configure all the scalability of increasing and so on, which is really great. And you no longer get into, I think I heard that a bit before as well, into this forklift upgrade where you need to throw the thing away. I mean, move everything from the old box to the new box, then throw the old box away and so on. It's really a kind of evolutionary way.
Do you have anything to add, George?
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with everything that they said. There's also, as far as the migration process, I'll kind of agree with Ron. A lot of the folks I talk to are they make this assumption that's kind of a whole hog. You have to get into HCI with everything, and that's absolutely not the case. But one of the considerations is, what are you going to move over? You may have some mission critical applications. What are you going to do with those, et cetera? So those are definitely some considerations. But overall, I mean, if you're using, a lot like VMware, for example, or other hypervisors that have ways to migrate, vMotion, storage, vMotion, et cetera, it can be painless, relatively painless to migrate.
Sure.
Alan.
When looking at this question, there's a couple of three different ways to look at it. Migrating to HCI, what did it look like for you? And honestly, if you ask 10,000 different users across a range of industries who've made the jump, you're going to get 10,000 different answers. You really are, because it depends on what your use case is, what the problems were you were trying to solve for by moving to HCI, and what the actual physical process looked like. Now, regardless if you're talking about, Scale or VMware or Pivot3, there's going to be minor differences between how we all size things. There will be minor differences between, what the stand-up procedures are for the individual platforms. But at the end of the day, any of us can pull in anybody else's legacy platforms, whether it's, bare metal, old school, that Windows 2000 box in the corner that you just can't quite get rid of. And don't laugh, I've had to do that for folks. Or, I'm really wanting to move from Hyper-V to something based on Scale or ESX or whatever. It's not a painful procedure. It's actually pretty slick. Some of us do it live with everything up and running. Others just quickly pop it over and keep going. So migrating to HCI shouldn't be your first concern. We've all made it pretty easy at this point.
Yeah, it is pretty much, regardless of how you go about it, the paradigm and technology has matured to the point where it should be pretty easy for you. That said, though, one of the things I want to ask you guys about is there are potential pitfalls. You don't know what you don't know, kind of stuff you can run into. Not many, but they're there. Max, let's start with you. What are some things to make sure and watch out for if you undertake this sort of migration?
Yeah, when you look at moving to hyperconverge, I think you need to look very hard at what you're trying to achieve, what your use case is, and why you're going to do that. Well, what's driving you to adopt hyperconverge? There are different platforms, different vendors which have different use cases. So when you're starting to look into that, you need to make sure that you look at the existing options on the market and you make the appropriate choice. That's to me one of the it's not really a gotcha, but it's avoiding getting into a gotcha a bit later. The other thing is you need to. I mean, it's tied to that in a way, but if you're going for a kind of a robot deployment, you need to look as well at whether one or the other platform is going to be adapted to that. So it's more or less this, making sure that you're not oversizing things or undersizing things, and that will be pretty much, I'd say.
Would you add anything there, Alan?
I would, but from a bit different perspective. When you keep in mind why hyperconvergence was created in the first place, it was to eliminate complexity. At the end of the day, it really was. Legacy approaches to virtualization, regardless of whose you're talking about, they were complex. There was a lot of moving parts. You needed to have 4 or 5 guys from 3 or 4 different disciplines. And collectively, a lot of those guys loved their nerd knobs. There was a lot of things they had to think about with storage protocols and, which HBAs needed to be used at what revision levels, et cetera. There was a lot of energy spent spinning those wheels in getting architecture stood up historically. I think one of the gotchas to be avoided as you move out of that legacy world into one built on HCI is a mindset shift. Refocusing away from the minutia of standing up infrastructure and which storage protocol do I need to use and what frame size works the best and all that, and refocusing on things like, where do I want my business to be doing in 2, 3, 4 years? The reason is simple. Regardless of which platform you're talking about, and you've got representatives from a bunch of us here, we've spent the last decade making that stuff work right. The gotcha to be avoided is wasting time thinking about the stuff that doesn't really matter that much anymore in an HCI-based world.
We've got lots of good questions here, so I'm going to keep moving unless you have anything pressing to add, Ron or George.
I'll say quickly that one other consideration is that HCI is a very front-loaded architecture. I think this is consistent across all the kinds of solutions of HCI you can look at. So this means where your time is focused is in, like Alan mentioned, some of that mindset shift, and also what Max brought up about use case evaluation. You do the thinking ahead of time because the deployment, whether you're talking Pivot 3 or Scale or VMware, a lot of the deployment has really been tuned over the years to be something very simple, because we want you to be able to focus on the application, the use case, and some of those realities. The design aspects ahead of time are really where you want to focus your HCI design. I think that's where you could possibly reach some pitfalls, either in mindset, like Alan mentioned, or to some practical implementation steps.
Ron, you raise a really good point there. And if you don't mind, I'd like to expand on something you said there. Prior to the world of HCI, you really had to plan your sizing for the environment you wanted to build based on what you thought you might be doing 4, 5, 6, 7 years out from a needs perspective. And you really had to overbuy based on the technology of right now for what you might be doing or might not in 5 years down the road. Well, guess what? That's not the case with HCI, not at all. At this point, we've by and large solved those legacy Moore's Law-based problems about being able to mix and match and have it grow with you and be able to size storage and have that go up and down and compute go up and down. So there's another gotcha there. Don't size for what you need 5 years from now, other than for maybe that's how your CTO or CFO likes it. But rather size based on what your actual needs are right now, and utilize that inherent advantage of HCI of being able to mix and match with Intel's or AMD's latest processors 2 years from now and have it all still work.
Yeah, great point. Did you want to add anything, George?
Just really quickly, one of the gotchas that I've run into with customers, I guess I shouldn't say gotchas, but I've talked to customers who've deployed it and kind of ran into some roadblocks, was around planning for storage. So they're typically using a different architecture altogether for their SAN storage or NAS storage. And now they're going to have to take and put those workloads in HCI. It's not that they can't do it. It's just you've got to understand what you have over there and what's actually running that, and understand the performance before you put it over to and port it over to HCI. So that's where I've seen some gotcha, some undersizing, for example, on the performance side.
And so it's basically just about collecting your requirements.
Collect your data, test if possible, get as much information as you can from the vendor as far as their performance at different workload, different characteristics, different block sizes, et cetera. So understanding the workload you're using and how that translates to the architecture you're moving to. Because the last thing you want to do is move a mission critical workload over or a business critical workload over and have it not perform as well and have angry end users.
Yeah, agreed. All right, I'm gonna start with you, George, on this one since you're already warmed up. How hard is this to do? So we talked about kind of what it looks like, and the general consensus was we as hyperconvergence vendors have done all the hard work to make this a pretty easy process. But let's get kind of practical. Like, what does this really look like to begin this migration in practice? And when we say easy, what does that mean?
Oh, it's easy. Trust us. We're in product marketing. We understand. It's once again, it depends, right? It depends on the type of workloads you're running. I always go back to that. I ask customers when they say I'm interested in hyperconverged infrastructure, I ask them, what are you doing today? What are you running today? What is it running on? And that really will simplify what it will look like when it's up and going. But I think it depends. You can look at the existing investments. So if you're looking at moving certain workloads over, let's say you've got a certain number of targeted workloads you want to move over, and there are some that need to be left behind for some reason. Understanding that's important. You may have done an investment and bought a flash array, maybe like a pure storage array or something last year, in the last couple of years. Knowing that you can still take the VMs that you're running on your HCI solution and connect them to mount up volumes from that flash array definitely are helpful. So migration isn't that hard. I mean, the tools are there. They're typically built into the hypervisor, for example, to help move them over seamlessly, real time, et cetera. So typically that's not the hard part.
Yeah, so I would propose that anymore, what's hard about migrating from a SAN-based infrastructure to HCI is less technical, more organizational and procedural. It's about getting people to think differently about it. Your thoughts, Ron?
I agree. In fact, so in the earlier days of vSAN documentation and some of the things that grew up on our storage hub site, which is kind of like our place for all the technical things and nerdy things you want to find out, one of the things people kept looking for and were repeatedly asking those of us at VMware is like, hey, where's your migration guide? Where's your 400-page migration book? I'm used to these things. I need your migration Bible so I can put it in my SOPs. I'm scared. Where is it? Like, it's vMotion. So we made a joke about we were going to make a migration guide that's 400 pages long, and then the first page says step 1 vMotion to the HCI cluster, and then just be blank the rest of the pages. But all the fun ideas get shot down. So, but the reality, there has been a lot of effort with HCI. Make the migration story simple. Stop punishing people for evolving their technology. But there's always going to be some grinding there. There's always going to be some consideration. And whether that comes from an organizational side of okay, well, how does administration look? There's sometimes some FUD, some voodoo that's thrown out there hey, you don't want to go to HCI storage admin because you're not going to have any control. You're not going to be relevant anymore. It all goes to the VI admin or all goes to the Wintel guys. People still use that term. So what happens in reality with every HCI solution worth its salt that I've seen is we've got this thing called access controls, right? Going back to the stone age of technology. We have this idea that, hey, look, storage guy, the way I like to think of it is HCI elevates that storage guy to the storage architect that he wanted to be. Most storage people I talk to do not say, what my favorite part of the job is? Telling people they can't have 1 more terabyte for their cat photos and making lines. That's really what I signed up for, and I'm hoping to do some more. usually they say, I would love to design, I'd love to think more about how storage is integral and how that data flow is integral to what the company's doing. I'd like to be relevant to the business because that always gets a good eyes, and that's always more engaging work. That, I think, is what HCI is around. So you really have to attune to that. And Alan mentioned this earlier about, it's a mindset shift. That's totally true. I will mention, on the technical side, when it comes to moving from the SAN-based infrastructure, sometimes it's a question of, okay, how do we want to stage this and how do we want to bring it in? And then what's the result of doing that? So George mentioned, collect those requirements, understand what you're moving into, move in on a use case specific scenario. And I don't mean like, oh, well, HCI can only do one thing. That's not always the case. It's going to be about what you design for. But you have this opportunity, because the migration is so easy, you have this opportunity to bring it in thoughtfully, evaluate, wait, and then continue. And we have some customers that started migrating over to a complete HCI, knowing that, like, hey, this is our solution, we're going all HCI. They started that a year ago, and they're not halfway done yet. And that's okay. It's about what is working for your organization. And on that technical side, you have the ability to phase out as you need to and bring that in. When you start phasing out, then you get the fun stories. And you see these great pictures on LinkedIn and other places, people taking pictures of their racks before and after, like, here's our 9 racks full of stuff. And, oh, look, here's 1 rack that did more than the 9 racks were doing. All that fun stuff. You get that ability to collapse that out. You collapse complicated networking fabrics and collapse dedicated enclosures and all these things. And that's where the real fun begins. But you can do it thoughtfully and in a way that's in tune with the business at the same time.
Well, I don't know what kind of storage architects you've been talking to, Ron, but I think Max wakes up in the morning to provision like per LUN iSCSI initiators and targets and match them all up.
It's got to be his favorite. Got to be his favorite.
Ron, I'm actually going to want to expand on a thought of yours from a moment ago. From our experience here at Scale, okay? One of the things that I see in that same spirit of what was it that you actually wanted to be doing, as opposed to carving off LUNs and tracking down where drop packets are going, et cetera, is being able to, like I was talking about earlier, refocus your mindset around what the needs of the business are. I've had tons of customers that were able to take and shift people out of storage management and that sort of thing into DevOps, into things that are much more individually rewarding, and reallocate those company resources, because now they're spending 10 minutes a week managing infrastructure instead of 4 full-time guys. Back to the original question, how hard is migration from SAN-based infrastructure to HCI? People, it's not. You don't need to think about LUNs. I can't speak to the specifics of George or Ron's platforms, but I can speak to mine, and there are no LUNs. There are no storage protocols. You don't need to waste the effort thinking about those things. That, with all of us here on the panel, that's kind of the point, is not just hiding those things, not just trying to wrap a little automation, but eliminating them, making them go away, providing the benefit that those brought and extending it in really new and innovative ways, but getting rid of their resource consumption, getting rid of you having to put that extra effort into thinking about infrastructure instead of thinking about your business. Well, that's what HCI does for you, regardless of who on the panel's platform you look at. That's what we all do, and we do it really well. So, migrating from to, we'll all say there's tools. We'll all say, yeah, there's native tools. We've got stuff built in. It's because we do. Part of our jobs collectively for the last decade was solving that problem and making it easy for you.
Did you want to add anything, Max, before we go to the next question?
No, I think that most of it has been covered. Just as a closing comment, I had an anecdote where we had our first HCI infrastructure deployed, and the storage guys reached out to us and were asking, okay, can we start playing with your thing? And we were like, there's nothing to play, it just works. You just get the storage capacity and you go do something else. So it's really a great opportunity for generalists or for, let's say, smaller organizations which just cannot afford having the cost of maintaining a lot of people working on the storage. So I think what Alan said, what Ron said, what George said was very relevant. Perhaps on the use case thing, which Ron was pointing to, you may want to take a stage approach. You don't want maybe to put everything at once there. We were talking about critical workloads. I think we'll get to that later, but you want to make sure that you move most of what you have. If you have some, VMs or .VM or whatever physical workload or RDMs and so on, you can take care of that later. But you can use HCI as the kind of the general purpose platform to be great.
Great. All right, let's move on. Alan, I'm going to kick this one to you. When we start looking at Robo and the edge, smaller deployments, so as opposed to I'm going to take out this giant SAN infrastructure and replace it with HCI, let's say we're in a retail situation or something like that. Is it economically viable to deploy an HCI infrastructure? I think some people have this idea that there's a kind of a minimum deployment size to start with, and it's a pretty sizable investment. I don't know that that's necessarily true. What are your thoughts on that?
So I guess I would open this by saying that everybody on this panel, and even the folks that aren't on this panel from the various HCI vendors out there in the world, chose different paths to HCI in general, okay? And something that works very well for one at a specific scale, specific size, may not work terribly well for a different one at a specific size. So with that being said, I know for a fact that SMB Robo is, well, it's one of our sweet spots. That's one of the things that we built our platform for. And without devolving into a religious war about this approach or that approach, my just kind of general advice to the audience would be this. Take a look at the use case in question. What the sizes are. Is this going on an oil derrick out in the Gulf? Or is this going in my main data center that sucks up almost as much power as Google's does? That's going to help you divine which platform is which vendor is the right direction to head in to solve your specific problems. As far as the overall question goes, yes, it absolutely is economically viable. As an amusing side note, I just demonstrated our entire stack running on an Intel NUC-based platform. Doesn't get much smaller than that.
Yeah, so it doesn't take a whole lot. George, any thoughts?
No, I agree with Alan. I mean, the idea is if one of the main benefits is to simplify management and improve operational efficiency, why not do that in your remote branch offices, Robo, for example? You can shrink your footprint, right? You can have a person manage everything versus multiple people managing it. I mean, all around, it's a good idea. Obviously, it depends on the use case, the types of workloads you're running. Once again, that type of, for sizing purposes, is it worthwhile to go down that route depending on what you have? But for many, I'd say yes.
Ron.
Yeah, so scale is kind of the holy grail of pretty much any infrastructure technology you're going to see. I'm not stepping well outside of storage there. This idea.
Thank you, Ron.
Hey, no pun intended there, Alan, but good try. So the idea of being able to say my infrastructure can just run at whatever scale you throw at it, but we're all being realistic. We know that any given solution, I'll take my VMware hat off here, and I'll put my customer hat back on. If you come to me and say, well, my solution can run at any given scale you could possibly imagine for any given use case, I'm going to say, you either haven't heard of enough scales and use cases, or you're trying to put one over on me, right? What I think is remarkable about HCI is just how much of that story is widened, how far he's been able to push that out and say, no, really, we can hit these massive scales, and we can hit these very minimal scales. And what's been interesting lately in the technology market is the minimal scale isn't just about the small business anymore, although that is definitely a true heart and soul of driving American economy and driving world economy and all of that. And it's been a big story, of course, for VMware. The vSphere hypervisor definitely changed a lot for the SMB, but The reality is we're seeing huge global companies that do have these massive Google-sized data centers, right? But they're saying, yeah, but now we're doing this thing where we need this edge in that data center. Has to be totally segregated. Or we're doing this thing where we're kind of an interesting sort of company and we have a lot of moving vehicles that have sand in them a lot, if you're following me there. So, and they don't have the best internet connectivity, so we need to do interesting things to put stuff in them. And you get all these weird use cases you didn't hear of before in infrastructure because what they did before was they did without. There wasn't a solution that really scaled to it. So as they started to hodgepodge things together, HCI stepped in well and said, hey, look, simple, repeatable brick. Knock in a few of these, you get the resiliency and the ability you need at that scalability that you need. So, for example, vSAN being able to go down to as little as 2 nodes with single sockets means you can collapse into a lot of use cases there and get a lot done and still have that independent resiliency. So I think it's very economically viable. The question with economic viability is always going to be, though, what's your driving use case? And George made a good point of this. What's your driving use case? What are you trying to do? What are the expectations? If I'm just looking to store data as cheap as possible, look, I've got some free USB keys sitting here on my desk. I can mail it out to you. What do you need to actually do and achieve with it? What I think HCI matches up with well is the common expectation of I need some resiliency, I need some practical capability out of this, but I'm not looking to invest a maximum amount of funds on this. I think it does hit that nice economic viability point. It's well worth looking into for any of those cases.
I would like to echo that we're seeing the exact same thing you are, Ron. That SMB use case really showing up in the distributed enterprise, whether you're talking the chain of grocery stores or chain of drug stores or coffee shops or whatever, writ large, that's a massive enterprise organization. But when you actually look at the use case involved, that's as SMB as SMB gets. It's a store manager who is not a VCP and a CCNE and a SNIA certified storage engineer, but instead, he's a 20, 30, 40-year-old guy trying to keep the 17-year-olds that work there in the retail establishment showing up and not fighting with each other. He is not an IT specialist or even a generalist. So for that overall question, not only is it viable, the market's screaming for it.
Yeah. We'll go to you, Max, real quick, and then I think it's probably a good time for me to give away a gift card.
Yeah, perfect. I think that Alan really nailed this in the end, because that was going to be pretty much my argument, for whether it's economically viable. We need to stop looking at the price of goods, the price of physical hardware and items, and we need to look at the value that this is bringing. In fact, the challenge with you can run, let's say, best-of-breed infrastructure at robo-sites, and it might be cheaper from the tag price perspective. But ultimately, someone needs to manage that. When you're going with HCI, you're going to different operational model. You're managing things centrally in a consistent fashion. And if you're managing hundreds of sales points, like Alan was saying, you don't want to delegate the management to someone which is there. I mean, usually the footprint is very small. So you need to have the capability to manage everything centrally. And it makes much more sense economically than running that on a traditional infrastructure in the end.
Agreed. All right, before we move on to the next question, I'm going to give away a gift card. Winner of the first $100 Amazon.com gift card is Robert Theobald from Pennsylvania. Robert, congratulations. We'll be reaching out to you about that. All right, guys. I'm looking at the questions that are coming in from the audience here before we go on to my next slide. I think they want to get a little nerdy, so let's take a slight detour here. I'm sure nobody will be super opposed to that. We were talking earlier about how the management of storage is you've taken care of that, right? We don't have to think about it. Naturally, the nerds want to know how. So let's just briefly talk about, so since I don't need to deal with that, how is it handled across all the nodes? And give me just kind of the highlights technically for hyperconverged storage and how it works. We'll start with you, Alan.
Honestly, every single one of us on this panel, our platforms do it differently, very differently. You know, some people would call it competitive differentiation. Some people would call it use case differentiation. So I'm not going to speak to how other guys do it, but I'll tell you how we do. Scale specifically eliminated file systems throughout the stacks. There is none of the, legacy object file sitting on a file system, sitting on another object file, sitting on another file system mapped across a network fabric to a object file that's sitting on a file system, sitting on a RAID set. All of that is gone, all of it. We take low-level control of the individual block devices throughout the entire cluster, okay? Subdivide them by what type they are, putting NVMe into one tier, SSD into another tier, spinners into yet another tier, so on and so forth. Now, we then work by pairing individual blocks on different drives on different nodes to create reliable blocks that we hand directly to individual virtual machines. The placement of those blocks are dynamic, and the whole thing's governed by state machines that handle migration of blocks to what tiers they need to be in automatically, although we've got a cool little slider that goes to 11 if you want to do it manually. Otherwise, our AI engine figures out what really needs to be where, when, all on its own. Like I said, I don't want to speak for how the other guys do it. They've got their own ways of doing it, and they've got some cool stuff going on there too. But our core focus has been to spend the last decade looking at what different types of admins and different types of use cases, what are they all doing in common that they're not really telling each other about, or only talking to each other about in user groups, that sort of thing. And finding ways to automate that to make it so that they don't have to spend their time thinking about it. Not preventing them from thinking about it, but make it so you don't have to. Because at the end of the day, it really is a trust thing. And once you see any of the platforms in question in action, you're able to actually start developing that trust.
Ron, do you want to add anything from a technical perspective?
Sure. So VMware has spent a lot of time with the VM, no surprise there. And as part of that legacy of 20 plus years of building basically new ways to virtualize and understand VMs, the whole point of that was to make the application the king. And this is the end of the day. For all of the cool things, and we can talk about space consolidation, we can talk about not needing a bunch of dedicated hardware, we can talk about interesting things you can do with the software and to push those use cases. I think the common linchpin of HCI is making the application the king in one way or another. Bringing the focus back to what an application does. Where VMware takes this approach is through something we call storage policy-based management, SPBM, because we really like unpronounceable acronyms. So the idea is, to get nerdy with it a little bit, each VM, and in fact each VMDK is a control point for vSAN. Now this doesn't mean I'm going VMDK by VMDK saying let's check a bunch of little knobs and let's do this for 3,000 VMDKs I have. I have a default policy. That default policy makes a lot of sense to me. I change that default policy based on my needs. I can change that default policy gradually. I can split policies, things like that. But to give a practical example of how all this works, with vSAN, you have one data store, and your specificity doesn't come from, oh, I've got SQL servers now I'm loading in. Before I was loading in some, mid-tier applications and my mission-critical apps, but now I want to actually bring in the back end for this, the SQL databases. Now I need a new line, or now I need some kind of new volume. No, one data store. I'll take that SQL VM or that set of SQL VMs and I'll apply a storage policy to the VM, or like I said, even down to the VMDK. And then I'll make that specific to a need I might have around perhaps greater resiliency, where I need more resiliency out of it. Perhaps I need certain performance characteristics that I expect. And the goal here isn't a bunch of tunable knobs. You'll find that the SPBM settings range pretty practically, give you a lot of control, but it's not knob after knob after knob, named with obscure settings. It's very practical stuff you want to control. So commonly what we'll show is like, hey, look, here's a SQL server. I have a transactions log VMDK, I have a database VMDK. I can give this two different policies on the same data store, have them have different but similar levels of protection, different performance characteristics, and things like that to deal with the fact that transaction logs and database files don't act the same way. I get that specificity to make the application the king. That's how VMware kind of drives that sort of control point, is through that policy-based management. And we wrap that all up in vCenter and say, look, you've used vCenter for years to manage your RAM and your CPU. Now it manages your storage, and it manages your storage in the same kind of mindset. A VM at a time, making the application the focus.
We'll give you a chance quick, George, and then let's move back to the slide here. Anything you want to add from a technical perspective?
Yeah, just from, you know, they were saying, both Alan and Ram said there's two different ways we can do this. There's a file-based, there's a block-based. We do block. We do basically a scale-out storage across all the nodes, white striped across everything, and we erase your code across all the nodes as well for protection, efficient protection. And then what I'll speak about, I think, in a few minutes is just about we have got a QoS engine, basically, a policy-based, very similar to the PBM. Is just you assign policies to workloads based on their criticality, and it assigns minimum performance levels and enforces them.
So across the board, the point is it's the workload that matters, and that's what we think about and tune, not LUN or whatever. Okay, next question I want to go to is HCI suited for my production business critical workloads? We were just, I was doing a different webinar earlier today and asked people what kinds of workloads are you really concerned about? And it was what you would expect, you know, production databases, email, ERP, this kind of stuff. So Max, let's start with you. At this point in the game, is HCI suited for those really important, can't go down, must perform kind of workloads?
I would say that it depends. Probably yes. It depends which kind of platform with which characteristic. We were talking at the beginning about the importance of sizing things properly. I think George was saying that you need to look at the performance of the solution that you're looking at, because you have different vendors. You have within each vendor is proposing different size of nodes, different performance and all. But is it suited? Yes. Why not? I mean, define what is a business critical workload. If we're talking about highly available databases such as Oracle databases or SQL always-on databases, you can run that certainly on HCI. I mean, some may want to argue, but I would say that we've come to the maturity. HCI is not something new on the market. HCI has been around for almost 10 years now. So I think that it has the level of maturity to execute business critical workloads. Some of the HCI vendors even go that far to certify their platform, their solution with, even beyond Oracle, they go with SAP for HANA or other stuff. So I would say that yes, it is ready.
Sure. George?
Yeah, I'd agree. You know, at the end of the day, whether you're using traditional 3-tier architecture or using HCI, the end user doesn't care, right? They just want you to be able to deliver what they're asking for. So I think many, you know, when we first, probably a few years ago, we were probably one of the only in the market that had NVMe flash. Now mostly everyone's got NVMe. So that takes care of a lot of that low latency requirement, you know, quick response. You pair that with quality of service. Most hyperconverged vendors have some sort of quality of service built in to ensure you kind of minimize that noisy neighbor effect or resource contention, those types of things. And those really matter when you're dealing with mission and business critical applications, because they can be affected by the smallest issue. But I think you can definitely do it. We're doing it now, so yeah.
Alan, what are your thoughts?
Well, my thoughts are this was a fantastic question if it was 2011. But it's 2019. And my customer base, my existing, 4,500 plus customers out there running HC3 are 100% of them running business critical workloads, whether it's their SQL implementations or Oracle implementations or mail or mission critical business apps. That's a question that hasn't just been answered by us talking heads. Literally, we're talking heads on a panel here, but by people in the trenches using these platforms, whether it's Pivot 3 or the various permutations of VMware or Scale's HC3. We've proven that time and again every day.
Do you want to add anything there, Ron?
Yeah, I'm definitely going to agree with George, Max, and Alan here that this is I think it's a well-explored path. There's a lot of mission-critical workloads running on HCI. I think you do need to be thoughtful always. If someone comes to me and says, hey, can I run my mission-critical workload on vSAN? My answer isn't just me, oh, yes, of course you can. It's going to be, what are you trying to do? You look at some things, like I'll pick on SAP HANA here. There's a very specific set of certification for that. Now, vSAN is, for example, a platform that can do that, but you want to think about the platform and its certification with the application. If such a thing exists, if a certification doesn't exist, that doesn't just mean, oh, sure, green card, go ahead. There's always a question of being thoughtful. We've hammered on this before, but being thoughtful about the use case. And a lot of times what's been interesting about HCI, and George brought this up with like NVMe Flash and things like that, there's this fun cat and mouse game going on with hardware and software, always has been, right? Hardware comes out with a new evolutionary leap, like 3D NAND, and then NVMe, and then getting into NVDIMM and things like this. And software has been saying, okay, I want to consume that, I want to consume that, I want to consume that. And because HCI is such a software-centric world, it's able to play that cat and mouse game a lot more effectively. And we're able to catch that. And then there's a lot of times where, as software, I think George and Ellen can attest to this. There's been times where, like, okay, we jumped ahead. You know, now we're kind of a cat waiting for the mouse to show up again. And then the hardware jumps ahead. We're like, okay, time to jump, time to get to work, roll up sleeves and get this going, you know, and work early with the vendors early and often, get that day zero support, all that good stuff. But for the mission critical workload, you definitely want to be thoughtful about what you're doing. You definitely want to see some validation. If I'm talking to an HCI vendor, I want to say, okay, my mission critical workload is, let's say, Oracle. Tell me about your Oracle customers. And counts, it's fun to talk customer counts. It's fun to throw out, you know, X number of customers, whatever. But talking about the depth of your customer's integration, and do you have some reference architecture? Do you have some, I always love the customer reference calls. When I was a customer myself, before I consumed an HCI solution, what we chose to do was, hey, I want to talk to one of your customers actually doing this. I want to hear from them. And then what goes around comes around, right? So we ended up talking to several customers who said, okay, well, we're thinking about the same HCI solution you are. Tell us, you know, and the vendor would hang up. They wouldn't be on the phone and say, okay, tell us a story, good, bad, ugly, all of that. And it's a very open path, and it's always good. Take advantage of the conferences that a lot of vendors host. Take advantage of those tech events. Take advantage of things that Actual Tech Media puts on with the different webinars and discussion groups and things like that. Ask those naked questions about, hey, what are you guys doing? Is this successful? What are the gotchas you've run into? Get that kind of cross-validation. Anecdotes do kind of mean something. A colleague of mine is fond of pointing out the plural of anecdote is not data. However, it's certainly something to think about. The data comes from, do you have a reference architecture? Can you help me through this? Is this something I can practically implement? If the answer is yes, we've got a well-established market going back, let's call it 10 years of HCI from different kinds of solution sets that is showing, yeah, business critical workloads, we're there.
All right, I'm going to give another gift card away, and then we'll jump back. We got probably time for one or two more. Let me draw one more here. Next gift card is going to go to Susan Kerr from Washington. Susan, thanks for joining us. We'll be in touch to deliver your gift card. All right, I want to talk about this one. So we've done a lot of talking about deploying hyperconverged infrastructure on-prem to replace traditional infrastructure. In many, many cases, that's not all there is to the story anymore. And so one attendee asks, how do I set this up to play nice with whatever public cloud infrastructure I've got set up, whether that's AWS or Azure, GCP, something else? How does that fit into the picture, and what does that look like paired with HCI? George.
Yeah, I mean, bottom line is all vendors pretty much have some pretty good tools to allow any customer to access AWS, Azure, Google, not only from a from a backup and recovery standpoint. That's one of them, right? Just being able to, maybe you don't have a remote site, being able to replicate data off to the cloud versus having to stand up an infrastructure remotely, or being able to migrate workloads, complete workloads. Workload migration, those types of things. I would say that those are they're pretty well baked into many of the platforms that are out there right now. Because, and secondly, it needs to appear like it's completely native, right? You want everything to appear like it's in your physical data center and not like it's completely disparate, et cetera. So many of us have actually built those things in, but those are things to look for.
Max?
Yeah, we need to look at HCI as a consumption model for infrastructure. It's a different way, it's packaged differently. So it's not that HCI is different than any kind of infrastructure. I would say that, like George was saying, all of the HCI platforms do have, to some extent, capabilities to interface with public cloud infrastructure. Then some do it better, some of it maybe a bit less or different, but as George was saying, you do have, first of all, you can use the platform to build some hybrid cloud capabilities so that you get to manage everything as if it was a single entity, regardless of whether your workload is on the cloud or is locally. Then you have some other features which are more about disaster recovery, replication, whatsoever. And you do have as well, and I kind of lost my thought of thinking, but you do have also, yes, some of the HCI vendors even create virtual appliances which execute directly on the cloud, where you can use that to move the data. So I don't have any let's say concern about compatibility of HCI with the cloud.
Ron?
So I like to think, being the optimist I am, that HCI learned a lot of its lessons. So we talked before about migration and how, just being very frank, the history of storage is littered with problematic migration stories, and HCI really sought to be a different animal and make this easy. I think compatibility is another one. We are well past the days of betting against the cloud here and saying, this cloud thing, I don't know about that, right? What we found at VMware, and I think this isn't by any means a unique revelation or something that only VMware is seeing or thinking about, is that the world is really about a hybrid cloud world. There's case for on-prem, there's case for cloud premises, there's case for cloud to cloud, and all kinds of things in between. So where HCI stands is there needs to be a relevance there. There needs to be a capability to execute, because what people are looking for out of cloud, we found through all of our lessons learned, going through the history of VMware's involvement in public cloud, we found that really what people are looking for is an operating model. Hey, I want to consume this service. I want it to provide me a platform to execute applications. I don't want any of the complication. I don't want any of the religious wars behind it. And I want you to be able to integrate that with other things you're going to offer me. So don't come talking about HCI if it's going to interfere with the things I'm already asking you to do out of the cloud operating model, whatever that private public cloud, go into your favorite buzzword here, right? So for VMware, the approach we've taken there is obviously manyfold. VMC on AWS is a vSAN platform. It is running hyperconverged, but it's on Amazon. It's on AWS. And the point of that, of course, is I don't want that in my data center. I can't have that in my data center, but I want that same HCI ease of use. It's HCI as a service, if you will. Of course, giving you a lot of great extra things besides the storage side with NSX and all the goodness. And then there's things like, I've heard you doing things like VMC on Azure. Or what about GCP? Or something like this. I'm using these services because they're making sense for me. So Alan mentioned before about, people transitioning over to to DevOps and things like that as the tech world evolves. So there's more and more demand for this cloud consumption model for lots of reasons. Where HCI stands as a whole, and I think really I can say specifically where vSAN stands well with this, is we're providing a platform model, we're providing a lot of versatility, and we're providing a lot of fluidity there. And where there's specific needs for integrations, we're always listening to that. We're always looking at ways to closer integrate. A lot of things I think, get me in trouble here for NDA stuff, but there's a lot of things that we're seeking to do to bring that story even closer, because and it's not just like hey, let's throw darts at a board and see what feature we can come up this week. It's people saying, look, I'm consuming this on GCP today. You can argue till you're blue in the face, but this is what I'm doing right now. What do I do about that? I'm consuming this on Azure today. I'm making these choices about AWS today. How do we create that relevance? And it really needs to be a couple of things. I want to say briefly that, one, HCI needs to be able to be an agile platform that I can bring data around, bring data back and forth, communicate data between, set up easily, have a lot of communication points. And two, it needs to be ultimately a platform for services, whether that's services provided directly by the HCI platform, services provided by third parties. VMware has a great legacy of third parties, and that's true on the HCI side as well. We have third parties that plug into vSAN and provide specific features that a niche set may be looking for. So you've got all these stories about HCI's integration to cloud, and it really comes into build with the same kind of mentality and operating model.
Alan, your thoughts here, and at the same time, any closing remarks on just in general HCI adoption, migration, all that kind of stuff we've been talking about today?
Absolutely. So I'm going to take a little different approach to answering this question than George and Ron and Max did. I'm going to take a look at things from a historical perspective. I would posit to the group at large that HCI, again, regardless of which of us platforms you're talking about, and cloud sprang from the same need in the same place. If you go back mid-2005, 6, 7, virtual infrastructure was complex. It was complex as hell. A lot of moving parts, different vendors, different everything being kind of shoehorned in together through adoption of protocols designed for different things, etc. End of the day, it was really complex for a lot of folks to be able to stand up and run virtual infrastructure. They needed it, but the complexities and costs tended to push it out of reach for everybody from SMB to mid-market and other places. Now, to answer that siren song, if you will, two different approaches kind of sprang to the fore. The cloud-based approach, well, I'll speak for Amazon since they're not in the room. We've got a pile of surplus capability, and the people that know how to run it, we can simplify that guy's problem of complex, expensive infrastructure. On the other side of the coin, you've got HCI, who said, you know what? We're going to take that inverted pyramid of doom, the legacy 3-2-1, as George called it earlier. I call it the inverted pyramid of doom and always have, the multiple server switches, SAN, hypervisor, so on and so forth. And we're going to clean sheet of paper redesign how that should have worked in the first place. Now, it's interesting, even though there's differences between my platform and Ron's and George's and various other folks that aren't in the room here, we all came to a very similar place with HCI, and we were answering that same question. Make it easy to consume. Make it so you don't need to be specialists, etc. Now, as we've moved forward over the past 10 years, you've got the cloud folks discovering that, no, not everything belongs in the cloud. You've got the on-prem folks going, storage over there on AWS or Glacier is a heck of a lot cheaper than spinning disks here in my archive or that tape library. And what you're starting to see is something that we here at Scale have been talking about for years, which is the future's hybrid. Realistically, the past 5 years has been hybrid. There's stuff that belongs on-prem, stuff that belongs in cloud de jour, and stuff that transitions back and forth between them. Whether that's having virtual machines that you spin up on GCP, like Ron was talking about, like we do, and spin them down and spin them up here, and then spin them down, spin them out over here at the edge, or putting this workload here and that cloud talking to this one. At the end of the day, it's all about putting resource consumption where it makes the most sense and having it be fluid between those locations to keep up with your business. So if you're asking me, is HCI compatible with public cloud infrastructure? I would honestly say it's two legs of a three-legged stool, and the stool doesn't stand without at least both of those.
Very good. Thanks, Alan. We are out of time here. I've got one more gift card to give away. I also want to ask one last question before you all go. Final gift card is going to go to Angelo Johnson from Illinois. Angelo, congratulations. We'll be reaching out to you about that. And before we go, Max, I have a question for you. And let me just explain to the audience. The other three guys, I think, one, have a horse in the race, and two, have some very careful boundaries around what they're working on internally that they can't talk about. So I'm just going to ask Max, like, is HCI what we're going to do forever? What are your thoughts about what comes next architecturally, from a business standpoint, anything? Final comment from you.
Okay. Well, it's not that I want to shoot at my colleagues here on the panel, but looking at what's next after HCI, I mean, to me, the thing which is the most, let's say, interesting, or where I see the industry moving, but guys, please keep me honest and shoot at me if I say something stupid, right? To me, the next step after HCI is composability of infrastructures. I mean, look at where we've come from. I think Alan has really made the case of the sorry to be rude, the crazy hell we had in 2007. Look at converged infrastructure, what we had. So you wanted to talk about flexibility, you wanted to get easy to manage things, which are very simple. I mean, look at converged infrastructure. You never want to get back there again. Yeah, hyperconverged has brought in the simplicity of that. I mean, if you, I'm not gonna make names, but you see these very big racks I'm talking about. So HCI is really, let's say, to me, it's the soft spot. It's the standard way of deploying IT infrastructure these days. If you're doing it differently, you need to have a really good reason why you do that, because HCI brings you everything. But what's after HCI? Looking at HCI, to me, is still very much tied with virtualization. And virtualization has been around for almost 20 years now. It's not going away, but I think that it's probably going to gradually start, fading out for new deployment models for applications. We're going to get more of cloud-native applications. We're going to get containers again. I don't want to push too much on containers because it can be a bit of a fad, but we're getting different ways of consuming the infrastructure. So to me, what seems to be the logical next step in terms of consuming infrastructure is really composability, composable infrastructures. Getting hardware resources, pools of resources. We're going to see that more and more with Gen Z architectures, really disaggregated trays or stacks of components like processors, memory, GPUs, network cards, and so on. And you're going to be able to compose these into whatever, let's say, logical servers or logical units that you need at the moment. So to me, that's the direction we're headed to. I may be wrong, but that seems to be the logical way for me.
Very good. Appreciate it, Max. Thank you to everybody for joining us today. I'm sorry we went 3 minutes long, but I had to hear what Max had to say there. Alan, Ron, George, Max, thank you so much for your time on the panel today. Appreciate it.
Thanks, guys.
All right, everybody. Have a great day.
Take care, guys. That was fun, by the way.
Thank you.